McKay here, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. So back in March and April, this is March and April of 2015, this year, we did an in-depth series about depression, the symptoms of depression, what causes depression, how depression affects men differently than from women, and also what you can do to manage your depression. A lot of people resonated with that because they or someone they knew was struggling with depression. And one book that really resonated with me as I was researching for the series was a book called The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. It's by Dr. Jonathan Rottenberg. He is a professor of psychology at the University of South Florida. He specializes in emotion, particularly with an emphasis on major depressive disorder. Anyways, in his book, The Depths, he makes the case that depression is actually an evolved tendency or trait in human beings, and that at one time it served an adaptive purpose in our long ago past. And that today, the reason why we see so many people depressed is that our environment, our emotional system isn't set up for our modern environment with all the stress and lack of sleep and the sedentary lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. It's a fascinating book, and it gives you a much more nuanced view of depression. And so today on the show, Dr. Rottenberg are going to discuss this theory, this evolutionary theory of the origins of depression, and then how this view of depression can change how we approach treating it. So if you are struggling with depression, or if you know someone who's struggling with depression, I think you'll get a lot out of the show, a lot of interesting insights. So let's do this. Jonathan Rottenberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So your book is called The Depths. It's about depression. But before we get into the meat of your book, 'cause it's just completely fascinating, can we start with this? Like, what is depression? Because, I'm writing a series of posts about depression right now, and I've been doing so much research about it. And it seems like every book I've read has a different idea or conception of depression. And it's confusing. I'm honestly I'm more confused now about depression than I was before. So how do you what is depression for you? How do you define it?
Yeah, the definition is very important, because how you define the problem is going to very much guide you to the kind of solution that you might follow. So depression for me, and this actually does follow the psychiatric definition of depression, is a mood condition, which is to say people who are depressed report that they feel low, they feel sad, they feel blue, and they also report that they're unable to experience pleasure in the things that normally brought them joy, things that they were normally interested in. That joy, that pleasure is now absent. And it's a mood state that, unlike ordinary sadness, when you might experience some kind of disappointment, or you might have a setback, this sadness is very hard to shake. In clinical depression, the person not only has this low mood, but then has a number of other symptoms that are associated with the low mood that go on for weeks, they can go on for months, they can even go on for years. So in addition to the low mood, the person will have trouble sleeping, they might lose their appetite, they have trouble concentrating, they're very fatigued, and some of the most troubling parts of depression is a person feels that life is not worth living. They might think about hurting themselves, they might even attempt suicide, and tragically some people who have depression die by suicide. So the symptoms can be very, very serious.
Okay. And you talked about mood, and that's sort of interesting because you come from a mood science perspective. That's what you do, is mood science. Can you explain what mood is? How is that different from, say, temperament or feelings?
Well, mood is a very important organizing idea in psychology, because our moods not only reflect our feelings. So we talk about, I'm in a good mood, I'm in a bad mood, and feelings are a part of what mood is. But moods also organize us. So when we're in a good mood, we not only feel good, but we're prepared to take certain actions. So, for example, I'm in a good mood, and that's when I want to get together with friends. That's when I want to have fun. Conversely, when I'm in a really low mood, I tend to withdraw, and the mood actually makes me more likely or less likely to do certain things. So moods actually have this ability to kind of harness, so to change our cognitions, to change what's going on in our body, and so they're more than just a feeling state. They actually organize our activities.
Okay, and humans aren't the only ones who experience moods. Animals do as well.
Yeah, I mean, you could have an interesting conversation about where in the phylogenetic chain does mood begin? Does an amoeba, because it can approach a nutrition gradient, have mood? Well, probably that's too elastic a term, but certainly other mammals, they have brains that are very similar in how they're organized to us. They have many of the same evolutionary goals: to survive, to reproduce, to mate, to make alliances, and so forth. And they too have moods to help organize these activities, even though they can't report. A chimpanzee cannot report, "I'm feeling sad." It nevertheless, when the mother chimpanzee sees the baby chimpanzee die, it has very similar behaviors and very similar things going on inside the mother chimp's body as humans do when they're grieving the loss of their own infant.
Yeah, I think you write about that in the book, and it's really sad reading about what happens when a chimp mourns the death of her baby. I mean, she holds it and tries to like revive it, and it's really touching. I don't know, it's really pretty sad.
Yeah, it is sad, but it's also, if you think about it, we should be grateful that we have this capacity. When something really bad happens, like you're a mother and you've just invested 9 months in a baby, and your baby dies, this is a moment to stop and think about what your next move is. It's not a in humans, grief, the loss of a loved one is almost a universal. I mean, across different cultures, across history, there are many different rituals for grief, but always there is this stopping and pausing. And low mood, again, organizes that. It forces us to think, what does this person mean to us? What do we do now that they're gone? How do we carry on? And this is actually useful. Imagine if we paid no attention and we just went on as we were before. When something that serious happened, maybe they died because there was an illness sweeping the land, or because there were enemies about. Death is always a sign to pay attention to what's going on and what can we learn from this. So it's low mood makes us stop. It makes us analyze the environment really carefully, in part so we don't repeat the same mistakes that got us into this situation in the first place.
Okay, and so that leads us into sort of the meat of your book, and you make the case that depression may have an evolutionary purpose. And so when people hear that, I mean, I guess the first thing that came to my mind was like, how could something that we see as maladaptive, because no one wants to be depressed, right? It makes us feel terrible, and you want to just stay home all the time and not do anything. How can that be adaptive?
Well, you have to think about evolution and what the point of evolution is. The point of evolution is survival, reproduction. The point of evolution is not happiness. And so there are many things that evolution has clearly selected for that are not pleasant. So in addition to low mood, pain comes out. A very good example. When you feel pain, you will guard an injured site in your body. You won't move it. And pain makes you not want to do things, sort of like depression makes you not want to do things. But again, if you didn't have it, you would be unable to heal, and a serious injury would become much worse. Similarly, anxiety, which is it's a very unpleasant state. But if we were unable to anticipate dangers, those organisms that were unable to anticipate dangers, sadly, are no longer with us. And so we're left with this evolutionary legacy to be capable of these anxiety states, which sometimes become very unpleasant. Just like low mood sometimes becomes very unpleasant and can even become very crippling. But that capacity, the ability to have low mood in the first place, I think the evidence is pretty good that we see this across species, and it's not an accident that across cultures and across species there is this capacity.
So why do we get depressed? I mean, what purpose does it serve? Is just to withdraw if things aren't right and sort of reevaluate? Is that the purpose of?
Yeah. So the mood system is incredibly sensitive to a whole variety of cues that are related to survival and reproduction. So, for example, over the eons, when it's dark, we're much less active. There are no rewards at night. You can't hunt it's very hard to find edible berries by the moonlight. And conversely, when it's light out, we typically have access to rewards, and so we feel our mood is much higher. And so we typically, and you'd see this, here in the northern hemisphere, during the winter, people tend to experience more low mood. So that's one contribution. Another contribution is your physical health. And so when if you have a fever and you're ill, your mood is much lower. And again, that's to force you to slow down, to not pursue goals as vigorously, to allow your body to recover. But moods are also sensitive to the psychological state. So people, there's the situation. So people experience a variety of shocks, whether it's they get a poor grade on a test, or they get rebuffed by a lover, or they have problems on the job, and mood is responsive to those situations as well, in part for the same reasons that there's some situations, like imagine you get fired from your job, where now you're in a predicament. You have to figure out what to do next. You should not hastily proceed when you've experienced such a big loss. So there's a variety of things that can push people into a low mood, and unfortunately what's happening now is that our perfectly good adaptation low mood is being set off by a very large number of different things at the same time, kind of creating the perfect storm for mood, which explains why so many people are experiencing low mood and so many people are experiencing more severe depression for long periods of time.
Well, what are those things that are pushing more and more people into a low mood?
Well, so to stay on the example of light. So we evolved in the context of the rotating Earth and 24-hour cycle of light and dark, with the reliably feeling more energy and alertness at during the daytime than at night. Humans, when they moved into villages and started farming in permanent settlements, initially that was okay, but as they stayed in permanent settlements and became more urbanized, people got less and less daylight. And in more recent times, this has really increased dramatically, so that even in very sunny parts of the world, there's one study in San Diego, the average citizen is getting less than a half an hour of sunlight, and this is one of the most sunny places in the United States, a day. And that's kind of been replaced with light that people are getting at night, which is a really poor substitute for daylight. So, for example, people are lying in bed and looking at their laptop screens and their iPhone screens or their TVs, and this is having a bunch of bad effects. So the light does not benefit the mood system, but it also tricks the body, and it makes it harder for people to get to sleep. And sleep is another thing which is very tied to mood. So people are having more and more problems with sleep, in part because of these routines, and because of the hectic lives that people often lead, are getting less and less sleep. And so I would say two of the things that I would immediately say have changed that are contributing to this depression epidemic are a lack of light and sleep. Unfortunately, there are a number of other things. Like I said, it's kind of the perfect storm. So there are also there are also things going on in the psychological environment that I think are very harmful to mood that I hope we have a chance to talk about.
Yeah, like I mean, what are some of those? Is it just the our market economy? Is it just the constant stress of information overload? And what are some of those
Well,
things?
some of the things are actually quite paradoxical. So, again, the typical view of depression is that it's about defects and things that the person is doing wrong. And, people talk about a defective brain or defective genes and so forth. But I think that the reason that there's so much depression is really not so much because of things that humans don't do well or individual people who are defective, as things that humans are really, really good at. So, for example, humans are really, really good at setting goals, and they're really good actually at setting goals about very abstract things. For example, setting goals about their happiness. And one thing that has changed dramatically in the last 30 years or so is that more and more people have set these goals that I am going to be very happy. Now, that may sound like a benign goal, but at no time in human history have so many people trying to deliver the state of kind of reliable euphoria. The mood system, again, it's designed to absolutely periodically deliver a burst of pleasure when when your first date asks you to the prom, or you buy a groovy new car. You do get that shot of pleasure, but people have this belief that they can feel happy all the time. And actually, there are books that you can buy that essentially say, here are the 3 steps that you need to take in order to feel happy all the time. And it sounds benign, but what's actually happening is that many people are feeling okay or feeling somewhat down or depressed, and they're wondering, why am I not happier? Is there something wrong with me? Why am I not as happy as the people that I see on Facebook, my friends? I see their perfect vacations and their perfect families. That they compare themselves to these other people, and they compare to their mood to what they think they ought to feel, and they feel a lot worse. And they start to feel very discouraged. But it might be helpful to know that in reality, at no time in human history have ever people felt happy all the time. It really is an illusion.
Well, so what should the goal be? If you shouldn't focus on happiness, what
Well,
should you focus on?
sure. I think that it is important to find things that are meaningful in your life, and as a consequence of pursuing those goals. So, I'll bring my own case into this. So, before I wrote this book, this was actually more than 20 years ago. I experienced a very severe episode of depression that lasted a very long time. And it took a very long time for me to figure out how to kind of rebuild my life. And I think that many of the reasons that I experienced depression is that I did not have a lot of different activities that I found meaningful. And these activities, now I'm a psychologist, and I find the study of mood to be very valuable. And I also find the advocacy work that I'm doing to help people who have depression be less isolating, that also is very meaningful. I started a family. I now have more hobbies. When I had depression initially, I really had put all of my eggs into one basket. I had this goal that I was going to become a famous historian. And when that wasn't going well, everything kind of collapsed. So I guess I would say, to kind of summarize my experience, and I think it would be relevant to a lot of people who are listening to your show, is having a diversity of things that are meaningful to you, that are important to you. Don't worry about whether you're ecstatically happy one day. You will, as a byproduct of pursuing things that are meaningful, experience more well-being than if you simply have the goal to be happier, which is kind of like the goal. It's one of these goals that the harder you run, the faster the treadmill goes. It's sort of an impossible goal.
So here's a question I have. You're talking about some of these benefits of low mood, that it allows us time to reflect, maybe informs us that maybe this is a goal we should stop pursuing and maybe pursue something else. But when does that low mood shift to like severe depression, where the costs outweigh the benefits?
That's a great question, and it's not a question that has a really easy answer. Um, Again, many things that humans are great at, um, and I think are admirable qualities, um, are important, and I would not speak against. So, this idea that if you're failing at an important goal in America, we're always told that no matter what, you must persist. Uh, in part because from a young age, kids are told that you can do anything, and I don't want to be cast as the gloomy person who says that you should give up on goals at the slightest idea. That's low mood telling you to disinvest and so forth. But at some point, and many people persist, whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in a career, um, whether it's in some other venture, fame, to achieve great riches, they persist for a number of years in spite of this escalating low mood. When if they were able to disengage and think about some other things that they could do with their time to kind of again diversify their portfolio, or maybe um, develop a completely different goal completely, that this depression, which of course at the time was very destructive and very painful, may end up in the long view being something that they're thankful for, that they wouldn't trade because it helped them see other possibilities. But in our current system, we only see depression as a sign of weakness. We see depression as a broken brain or cognitions that need to be changed, and so people are really unable to make any use of these depressions. Kind of are have been listening to Prozac but not depression. To kind of put a point on it.
Okay, well, so I mean, you've kind of hit on this a little bit. Using this mood evolutionary perspective, someone who's struggling with depression. I mean, what's the best way to approach it? I mean, I guess do you try to cure depression, or is it better to just try to manage it?
You try to manage it, absolutely. And the really, I think, good news. The book has a lot of alarming facts about the direction that we're headed in, the difficulty of controlling depression, as a public health matter. So the incidence of depression is very high. It's concentrated in young people. But there's also a lot of good news, especially when you take this mood science perspective, because moods are responsive to so many different things. So I absolutely, if someone wanted to try medications, which are the dominant approach to depression, I would say that's fine. But don't limit yourself. You can also change your moods by changing your thoughts. So people often have very negative thoughts during a depression. They're often very harsh and self-accusatory kinds of thoughts. And there are both formal treatments in books that people can read to try to get a little bit better control over their thoughts. People can improve their mood by simply learning to tolerate the low moods better, which is another problem that happens when you're fixated on feeling happy all the time, that these low moods become just intolerable. You can change your physical routines. So things that I mean, I think many people know are benefit mood can even be beneficial to people who are really struggling with more significant low mood, like exercise, in getting more sunlight, you changing your social environment. So what happens in depression is that people tend to withdraw, and it's very understandable. You feel like hell. You don't want to talk to anyone. You feel like you have nothing to say. But the extent to which you can schedule in some social interactions, maybe you take it slow. But this is another way that by changing your social environment, you can change your mood. And finally, and this might take more time, but I think ultimately can be part of the solution for many people, is really re-examining your goals. Maybe you are committed to goals that really aren't working for you. Some people aren't able to do this all on their own, and that's okay. I mean, I would say if you have the ability to to find a therapist to work with for any of these issues. I think that can be very helpful. So I guess the mood approach is very eclectic in the sense that it sees that there are all these different tools available and that people should absolutely make use of them.
What do you tell the person who, because I've known people who have been in such a depressive state that they just have no motivation. And the thought of even doing some of these things that you talked about is just, it just seems impossible. So like, how do you bootstrap, right, to get to that point where you just, you get out and you change your social situation, or you get out into the sun, or, to do those things that can help your mood when you're just incapacitated?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so Rome wasn't built in a day. And I think also it's very important to tell people who are struggling with depression that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them, that they will eventually get better control over this mood state. But it may take some time. And I really think it is dangerous to overpromise. But telling people that from decades of epidemiology that even the worst depression eventually will lift, and the goal would be, what can we do to accelerate that lifting? What often happens, the folks that you're describing, and it's understandable when you feel so bad, that they've kind of lost morale. They've lost a belief that things can change. They've lost a belief in themselves. And so before people can really take some of the actions that I'm talking about, I think it's important to check in with them about their morale and be understanding that it may take some time, but that they're going to prevail. I mean, there's no question that one way or the other you will outlast this depression. Whether you can hasten its exit, whether you can learn from it, that's more up for grabs. But often people I think they've been kind of led down the garden path, maybe given false promises. If they do this treatment in 6 weeks, they'll be totally better, and then they're very disappointed, and then they don't believe the next person who makes promises to them. So I think the point about being very honest with people is important.
Okay. So yeah, what does recovery look like? Because I think some people have this idea that, okay, if I do these things, if I do cognitive behavioral therapy, or I take this medication, then one day I'll just wake up and I'll just be happy.
Yeah.
Is it more gradual? Is it you don't become happy? Is it just you're not depressed? I mean, what does that look like typically?
Yeah, and I wish that there was more conversation about exactly this, because I think this is really interesting and under discussed. So even what is the goal of treatment? If you just talk to people in psychiatry, so, in mainstream psychiatry, where they treat with medications, the goal of treatment, well, it's to reduce your symptoms, and that is great. But people are often satisfied that they've reduced your symptoms to a degree. I think that we need to set the bar a bit higher. I think the goal ultimately has to be that the person is satisfied with their life, that they're no longer troubled by a depression that they can't manage. There may still be ups and downs. There may still be some symptoms, but I think it's really important to have an explicit conversation about what is the goal actually, because I don't think that by just saying, well, we'd like to reduce your symptoms, that's, I think, setting the bar kind of low. Just saying that you have low symptoms could mean that you're still having problems with your sleep, that you're still having concentration difficulties, and that you're still having trouble enjoying things. I think it would be great to think more broadly about, again, this more purposeful life, that as a consequence of that, as a consequence of figuring out some better strategies to manage your low mood, you're just not as dominated by it. I think that really is the goal, to not be dominated by your moods. They're going to be a part of your life. You may not always want the moods. You may not always like the moods that you're having, but moods are no longer your enemy. Moods are to a greater extent your friend, and something that you can use. But so often people might get better for a time, and then the depression comes back, and they feel powerless. I mean, that can be even the worst the worst thing about a depression is this uncertainty, and this feeling that having no power over your mood whatsoever.
I should have asked this earlier, but I've read, are there differences between the way men and women express depression or experience it, or is it pretty much the same?
There are some differences. Depression is a bit more common in women, and so in some ways, our template for depression is a female one. I think that's unfortunate, because even if depression is more common in women than it is in men, depression is so common in people that it's incredibly common in men. And men may feel less comfortable talking about their depression in that society has identified this as a female problem. And again, it's connected to this notion of weakness, and men, of course, are not allowed. They're not allowed by the dominant culture to express vulnerability or weakness. So I think it is much as difficult as it is to be depressed for anyone. It's even more difficult for a man to struggle with depression, in that there is some greater barrier to letting other people know what's happening. It can be harder to get help. That certainly was true in my own case. Ideas about masculinity can be it can be an impediment to getting help and getting depression under control.
So you, in the book, and I thought it was really interesting, you talk about possibly reframing or, looking at your depression in a positive light, and that it could be instructive and helpful, or even finding meaning in the depression. How do you go about doing that, and how does that help someone?
Well, whether or not your depression is helpful or harmful really is something that you're only going to be able to determine years later. It's not. I'm not suggesting that it's some eureka moment, because their depression in mood generally is connected to very often to the overall trajectory of one's life, and whether or not you've learned all that you can learn from the situation that you're in, takes a lot of time. So in my own case, I experienced this depression, which I believe was related to, I mentioned having all of my career aspirations and all my eggs in one basket. But it was also related to a certain idea of who I was. And I saw myself as a kind of a creature of the mind. And when I started experiencing depression, my mental faculties really deteriorated. And I was no longer able to do that kind of work, and that was very threatening to me and made the depression that much worse. So I learned, in my case, I learned that many things, many of the ideas that I had were wrong, and I really learned that I could do something different in going into a new field. I think for other people, the lessons are going to be very different. There's no one universal meaning of what depression is, in part because it can be provoked by so many different things. So, depression can result from very physical things. So, for example, if someone is starving, and they did research on this in the Second World War, people experience very low mood as a secondary feature of not getting enough nutrition. So there's not always some grand psychological interpretation, but there often is. It often does have meaning, but you don't know immediately what it is.
Well, Jonathan, where can people find out more about your work?
Well, in addition to reading my book, I regularly blog on Psychology Today, and the blog is called Charting the Depths in the Huffington Post. And if they're interested in any of the advocacy work that I'm doing, because talking with you is part of starting a broader conversation about depression, and I'm very interested in doing that. So I have a group called Come Out of the Dark. So if you were even to Google the term Come Out of the Dark and Come Out of the Dark campaign, you'll see a number of links that come up that are describing that activity. We have an active Facebook presence. So the goal really is to expand our conversation about depression, to get people to kind of challenge the dominant way of seeing depression as being about defects, and to create a society where we uh, devote we understand depression better, and we're more tolerant of people who have struggled with depression, and we make use of the people who have struggled and have come out the other side.
Fantastic. Well, Jonathan Rottenberg, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's a delight to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Our guest today was Dr. Jonathan Rottenberg. He's the author of the book, The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. You can find that on Amazon.com and other bookstores. Also, check out his Facebook page. Just search for Jonathan Rottenberg. That's Rottenberg on Facebook. Or you can go to facebook.com/charting.the.depths. He posts a lot of interesting articles, latest research about depression. I think you'll find a lot of useful information there. Well, that wraps up another edition of the Art of Manliness podcast. For more manly tips and advice, make sure to check out the Art of Manliness website at artofmanliness.com. And if you enjoy the show, you've gotten something out of it, I'd really appreciate it if you would give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, whatever it is you use to listen to the podcast. That helps us get the word out about the podcast, so I'd really appreciate that. Also, if you can just recommend the podcast to a friend, I'd appreciate that as well. Anyways, until next time, this is Brett McKay telling you to stay manly.